Before abandoning his son in the desert, the millionaire father shouted, "Get out of my sight, you useless cripple!" But a year later, seeing him on television, he was in shock. I kindly ask you to listen until the end, give a thumbs up, and subscribe to the channel, as your attention helps the channel grow and allows me to create new and interesting stories. Thank you. The sun scorched the desert sky as if it wanted to devour everything in its path. The heat was suffocating, the dust rising in thick clouds, and a black luxury car moved along the dirt road. Inside the car, 10-year-old Jackson felt his heart pounding, as if he already knew something terrible was about to happen. From the boy's side, Michael Evans, his father, did not take his eyes off the road. The man, one of the wealthiest and most respected businessmen in Philadelphia, didn't say a word. But Jackson felt the chill in the air, the silence that meant more than any reprimand he had ever heard. Michael was known for his ruthlessness in business. The unforgiving stare was directed at him. Jackson's leg ached after an accident he had when he was 5, and he limped. The treatment was expensive, and Michael never let his son forget it. The boy had become a living reminder of what his father despised: imperfection. Suddenly, Michael stopped the car with a jolt, causing Jackson's small body to slam into the seat. He looked at his father, expecting an explanation, but what he received was much worse. "Get out!" Michael's voice was harsh, sharp, as if each word was an order. Jackson blinked, not believing what he heard. "Dad, what's happening? Why are we stopping here?" The man slowly turned to his son, and for the first time, Jackson saw absolute disdain in his father's eyes. "You're a burden, Jackson, a cripple. I no longer have time to care for someone as useless as you." In that moment, the boy's world crumbled. He thought it was a nightmare, that his father was just angry at something he had done. But no. Michael opened the car door, stepped out, and roughly yanked Jackson by the arm, hurling him to the ground like a useless object. "Get out of my sight. If you're good for something, you'll find a way to survive. If not..." Michael shrugged indifferently. "Life." Jackson landed heavily on the hot sand that scorched his skin. His injured knee throbbed, but before he could say anything, he heard the car door slam shut. The engine roared, raising a cloud of dust that quickly obscured his view. The last thing he heard was his father's shout, echoing across the open air. "Get out of my sight!" The car drove away, leaving only the deafening silence of the desert and the wind whistling through the dunes. Jackson stood for a while, staring into the space, expecting the car to return, but it didn't. Reality hit him like a blow to the stomach. He was alone, in the middle of the desert, at only 10 years old. Fear overcame him. Tears streamed down his dirty, sunburnt face, despair tightening around his chest as if it would strangle him. Jackson didn't understand that the father he admired, whom he loved, had left him to die. Nightfall brought the chilling cold of the desert, replacing the scorching day. But in that moment, a seed of determination was sown. He didn't know how, but he promised himself he would survive. Not to prove anything to his father, but to prove to himself that he was not useless, that he was worth much more than he could imagine. The abandoned boy took his first step into the desert, a hesitant, painful step, but it would lead him on a journey the world would never forget. The night in the desert was a nightmare that Jackson would never forget. The piercing cold made his teeth clatter uncontrollably, and the fine sand sifted into his torn clothes. He was only 10 years old, but he felt the weight of the entire world on his shoulders. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw his father's face. Michael's face, with that cold and ruthless expression, repeating words that hurt him more than any physical pain. Useless cripple. When the sun finally appeared on the horizon, his body ached and his lame leg pulsed. The new day brought more than pain. It brought a spark of hope. He knew he couldn't just sit and wait for a miracle. If he wanted to survive, he would have to find help, and fast. With the little strength he had left, Jackson got up. Each step was a battle. The heat began to climb rapidly, and the desert seemed endless. But the boy pushed forward, limping, stumbling, but never stopping. Hunger and thirst were torturous, yet the desire to prove that he was not the worthless person his father said he was drove him onward. Hours went by, and the sun relentlessly scorched Jackson's skin. His vision blurred. Before consciousness entirely left him, Jackson heard voices in the distance, strange voices in a language he did not know. He felt strong, rough hands lift him, and the last thought that came to him before he passed out was, "Maybe I still have a chance." When Jackson awoke, he was in a simple tent, but sheltered from the blazing sun. The scent of herbal tea and wood smoke filled the air. When he tried to sit, searing pain shot through his leg, but he forced himself to look around. Men with sun-marked faces and women with attentive eyes silently watched him. At that moment, an elderly woman with kind eyes and a wrinkled face approached him. She said something he didn't understand, but the tone was gentle, almost maternal. She placed a bowl of water beside him and gestured for him to drink. Jackson, his throat burning, didn't hesitate. The water was warm and murky, but it felt to him like the most precious nectar he had ever tasted. Days passed, and Jackson began slowly to recover under the care of this group of nomads. They lived in the desert, constantly moving, and he soon realized that despite the hard life, they were a united and resilient community. Even without understanding the language, Jackson observed them through gestures. Little by little, the fragile boy who had come close to death began to transform. The nomads taught him to find water in the most unexpected places, hunt small animals, and navigate by the stars. But more than anything, they taught Jackson to find strength within himself. There was one person in particular, Carl, who seemed to see something special in Jackson. He saw the determination in the boy's eyes, the same determination he had when he too fought to survive. One night, as they sat by the campfire's crackle, Carl sat beside Jackson. He pointed to the boy's lame leg and then to his heart. "True strength is not here," he said, pointing to a muscle on his arm. "It's here." Time passed unnoticed for Jackson. The desert, which had once been a place of abandonment, had now become his home. Every grain of sand, every star in the night sky, every scar on his body told a story of struggle and survival. The 10-year-old boy who had once been left to die now marched confidently alongside the nomads who had saved him. His lame leg still accompanied him, but it was no longer a symbol of weakness. It was a mark of his resilience. Carl became more than just a mentor to Jackson. He became the father figure he never had. Under the guidance of the nomad's leader, Jackson learned not just to survive, but to live. He learned to hunt, find water where it seemed impossible, and most importantly, never give up. The nights by the fire were moments of silent learning, where eyes spoke more than words. But deep inside, Jackson knew this was not the end of his story. The desert had shaped him, but there was still a void in his heart that could only be filled when he faced his past. One day, as the group was crossing a new region in search of better conditions, Jackson heard about a contest that would take place in a nearby town. It was a test of physical endurance, capable of breaking even the strongest. Jackson's eyes lit up. This was his chance to prove, not to the world, but to himself, that he was not the insignificant person his father had called him. He decided he would participate. Carl tried to dissuade him, fearing the danger, but Jackson was determined. He had already endured the worst the desert could offer, and now he was ready to overcome his pain. On the day of the contest, he was surrounded by strong, seasoned men, all of whom underestimated the limping boy who seemed out of place among them. But Jackson carried something none of them had: the memory of brutal rejection, and a silent promise that he would never again be left behind. The start signal was given, and the relentless sun punished everyone equally. But as other participants began to falter, Jackson kept going. Each step was fueled by his father's cruel words echoing in his mind, "Useless cripple." With every meter he completed, he freed himself a little more from those chains. The desert, which was once his enemy, had now become the arena of his victory. When he crossed the finish line, a hush fell. No one had expected that this boy with a weak leg and a story of abandonment would outrun everyone else. He stood there, his face sunburnt, his eyes gleaming not with tears, but with unwavering determination. The crowd erupted in applause, but Jackson heard none of it. For him, the true victory was within himself. He had conquered the greatest challenge of all: his past. The competition drew the attention of the local media, and soon the story of the lame boy who bravely crossed the desert became known. But Jackson wasn't seeking fame. Every interview, every published photo was just a reminder that he was keeping his promise. He had survived, and now the world began to see the strength that Michael Evans had tried to erase. Little did Jackson know that halfway around the world, in a cold mansion full of luxury, his father would see this story and realize what he had lost. To the world, he had become a symbol of resilience, but Jackson's true triumph was yet to come, as he needed not only to win races, but also to face the man who had left him behind and prove that the greatest power a person can have is to never give up on themselves. The crowd applauded loudly, but for Jackson, the scorching sand under his feet seemed insignificant compared to the flame that raged inside him. He was sure that he had won not only the race, but also over his past. Sand clung to his sweaty face, but Jackson didn't care. In that moment, he was no longer the boy who had been abandoned in the middle of the desert. He was a man who had survived the impossible. Camera flashes blinded him, and Jackson's heart pounded not from the race, but from vivid memories of the person he was trying to forget, Michael Evans, the father who left him to die. Jackson took a deep breath, trying to comprehend what had just happened. On the other side of the world, in a luxurious and cold mansion, Michael casually turned on the television, holding a glass of wine. He enjoyed watching the victors, people like him who had achieved everything through power and money. But then something changed. A name spoken on the TV made Michael freeze. Jackson Evans, a young man who defied death and became a symbol of resilience. The glass fell from Michael's hands and shattered on the marble floor, spilling red wine like blood. The face on the screen was unmistakably recognizable. The boy he had abandoned many years ago was now standing in front of the whole world, being cheered like a hero. Michael's heart raced more than it did during his riskiest deals. He always thought that money could buy everything, respect, power, and even silence. But it couldn't erase the past. And here he was before the television, a living reminder of the cruelty he had inflicted. Michael sat on the couch, his head in his hands, trying to understand what he was feeling. Guilt? It was a strange feeling for someone who always believed that weakness was for others. But seeing Jackson, strong and determined, bearing the last name he tried to bury, broke something inside him. The images continued to flash on the screen. Jackson was smiling, but his eyes told a different story. They carried the pain of many years of abandonment. Michael knew that smile wasn't for the public, it was for him. The smile said, "You tried to destroy me, but I prevailed anyway." And for the first time in many years, Michael Evans felt fear, not of the boy he had left in the desert, but of the man Jackson had become. Because deep down, Michael knew that true strength lies not in the money he had amassed, but in the power Jackson had gained amidst worldwide applause. Michael slowly got up, looking at his reflection on the screen. The person he saw was no longer a successful businessman. He was a father who had failed, and he knew that nothing he did now could change what he had done. But perhaps there was still a chance to ask for forgiveness if Jackson was willing to listen. The lights in Michael Evans' mansion shone brightly, but the coldness that filled the space couldn't be ignored. The television continued to play the images of Jackson's victory, now a symbol of resilience for the entire world. But for Michael, these images were not just inspiring. They were a brutal reminder of what he had done. Sitting in the leather chair, he stared at the face of the son he had abandoned many years ago. This was not the boy he had left in the desert. It was a young man with a determined gaze, a straight posture, and strength even Michael couldn't deny. Each of Jackson's moves on screen seemed to echo a silent scream. "I survived without you." The phone rang, breaking the deafening silence in the room. Michael answered automatically, still looking at the television. "Evans," said the voice on the other end of the line. "Isn't that your son?" The question hung in the air for a moment. Michael clenched the receiver tightly, feeling his throat go dry. "Yes, that's him." His voice was low, almost a whisper. There was a short silence on the other end before the caller continued. "He's in all the headlines. The whole world wants to know more about him. Maybe it's time for you to find him." Michael hung up without responding. How could he seek out someone he had left to die? The weight of guilt pressed upon him, and he knew there were no words in the world that could erase the past, but something inside him insisted that he needed to try. In the days that followed, Michael tracked Jackson's every move: interviews, public appearances, accolades. The boy he had called useless was now regarded as a hero, and this not only shocked him, but consumed him from within. How could he have been so blind? How did he not see the value in his own son? Meanwhile, Jackson continued his routine, shielded from the attention of the media, but still haunted by the past. He never forgot his father's face. The sound of those cruel words echoed in the desert. Each of his victories was, in part, a silent response to the man who had abandoned him, but fate, as always, had its own plans. A television channel organized a special event dedicated to Jackson's journey, inviting important figures from his career. Little did he know that among the guests would be someone he never expected to see again: his father. On the day of the event, the hall was full. The camera lights blurred everything as Jackson stepped onto the stage to thank everyone for their support. But when his eyes roamed the audience, he saw him, Michael Evans, sitting in the front row, eyes watery, fixed on his son. It felt as though time had stopped in that moment. Jackson's heart raced and his breath became labored. It seemed as if time had returned to that day when he was left in the desert. The audience, oblivious to what was happening, continued to applaud, but for Jackson, all sounds were drowned out by the buzz of his own thoughts. Michael rose and walked toward his son. Each step seemed to weigh a ton. Jackson stood still, his heart pounding so hard he could barely think. When Michael finally stopped in front of him, his eyes were teary. Jackson saw vulnerability in his father's face for the first time, and it surprised him. Father and son stared at each other for long seconds, as if trying to understand how to begin the conversation they had avoided for so long. Michael tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come out. Finally, Michael's voice broke the silence, quiet and uncertain. Jackson, I'm sorry for not being the father you deserved." Jackson listened without saying a word. These simple words were something he had longed to hear for so many years, yet now he felt only a deep void. "Why are you here?" Jackson finally asked, quietly but firmly. "Did you see on TV that the useless cripple survived? Are you proud now?" These words hurt Michael more than any physical blow could have. Michael swallowed, trying to collect his thoughts. "I made the biggest mistake of my life," he replied, his voice trembling. "I was weak. I thought perfection was everything and weakness was unacceptable, but the real weakness was mine. I left you, and for that, I'll never forgive myself." Jackson felt tears well up in his eyes, but he didn't want to show vulnerability. Not now. His heart was pounding so hard, it was impossible not to notice. "You left me to die, Michael. There's no excuse for that." Using his father's name instead of calling him Dad was like a blow. Michael felt that blow, but he knew he deserved it. "I know." Michael sighed deeply, not taking his eyes off Jackson. "I didn't come hoping for your forgiveness. I know I have no right to ask for it, but I wanted you to know that seeing you today, seeing the man you have become, is the greatest proof that I was wrong in everything." The weight of these words hung in the air. Jackson didn't know how to react. For many years he had dreamed of seeing Michael suffer, but now, witnessing it, he didn't feel the expected satisfaction. Hatred hadn't brought relief, it only deepened the emptiness inside him. After a few moments, Jackson took a step back. "You left me alone, but I'm no longer alone. I became who I am without you." His voice shook with emotion. "I don't know if I will ever be able to forgive. Maybe yes, maybe no. But now, Michael, you'll have to live with it just as I did." Michael lowered his head, feeling the tears finally stream down his face. Jackson turned and walked away, leaving his father there alone with the burden of his own choices. But before disappearing into the crowd, Jackson paused, took a deep breath, and looked back over his shoulder. "The only thing I can thank you for is that you made me stronger." And with those words he left, leaving Michael to face his own demons. Months passed since the meeting between Jackson and Michael, but the weight of that day still echoed in the hearts of both. Jackson continued his journey, now recognized not only as the young man who challenged the desert, but also as a source of inspiration. He became an inspiring speaker, traveling the world to tell his story and help others find strength in their own pain. Although the public saw it as a display of strength, an inner struggle raged, one Jackson had not yet won, the confrontation with the ghosts of the past. All the while, Michael lived in solitude in his mansion, surrounded by treasures that now seemed empty. Business continued. The empire he built stood firm, but it wasn't enough to fill the void in his heart. He watched Jackson's lectures on television. Every word from his son was a reminder of what he had destroyed with his cruelty and pride. Regret consumed him, yet he knew he couldn't forgive himself ultimately. One day, Jackson received a letter. It was simple, without pomp or demands, just a few words that made him pause, confronting the pain he had long avoided. "I don't ask for forgiveness, but I wanted you to know that even from afar, I will always be proud of the man you've become. If you ever want to talk, I will be waiting. Your father, Michael." Jackson stood still, staring at the paper. His heart pounded, his mind divided. He had spent years building a life without his father, proving to himself that he could overcome anything. But now he felt he had a choice to make. After several days of contemplation, Jackson decided to visit the place he hated the most, the mansion where he grew up and where he was abandoned. He didn't know if he was ready to forgive, but he knew he needed to confront this situation, not for Michael, but for himself. Upon arriving, he was met by Michael, who appeared noticeably older. The once cold eyes were now filled with regret and hope. They looked at each other for long seconds, the weight of the past suspended between them. "Why did you call me?" Jackson asked in a firm voice, but with less harshness than before. Michael took a deep breath, his eyes filled with tears. "Because I needed you to know that I love you, even when I was too blind to see who you were." Jackson felt the tension gradually dissolve. He didn't know if he could forgive immediately, but he knew he no longer wanted to carry the burden of anger. "I don't know if I'm ready to forgive you," he said, the words honest, without hatred, "but I know that I don't want the past to define my future." Michael nodded, accepting what his son offered him at that moment. They didn't embrace or cry, but the look they exchanged spoke volumes of what they still might build together. Jackson left the mansion with a lighter heart. He knew that the path to forgiveness would be long, but he was determined to move forward, free from the weight of hatred, because in the end, true strength was not only about surviving the desert, but also about finding peace within himself. As he left the house, Jackson knew that the past would always be a part of who he was, but now he was the author of his future. Did you enjoy this story? Tell us your thoughts in the comments, give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel to not miss new releases. See you soon.